What's the creepiest thing you have ever found in your attic? The most unsettling thing I ever found in our house started with my mother climbing into the attic. Every night at the exact same minute. It always happened at 11:47 p.m. Never earlier and never late. She waited until the house went quiet and everyone else was asleep. Then the attic ladder would lower inch by inch, wood groaning softly, as if it understood the need for silence. I would hear her careful steps climbing rung by rung, followed by complete stillness that lasted exactly 1 hour. After that the ladder would descend again and she would move through the hallway like nothing had happened. At first I tried to explain it away because it was easier to believe something harmless. Maybe she was hiding birthday gifts or planning some surprise. Maybe she had old boxes she needed to organize and did not want anyone watching. But it was the middle of July and the way she moved was wrong. Too cautious and deliberate, like she was entering a place where any sound could cause damage. So I started paying attention, and every single night it happened at 11:47 p.m. without fail. Before she climbed up she would stand at the bottom of the ladder for a full minute, not moving at all, like she was working up the nerve to face something waiting above. When she came back down, her eyes were always red and her hands shook like she had been crying or holding something heavy. One morning I finally asked her why she went up there every night. The coffee mug slipped from her hand and shattered across the kitchen floor. She said she had no idea what I was talking about and that I must have dreamed it, but there was attic dust in her hair and it smelled like insulation and forgotten years. I tried following her once, but she must have heard me because she came down immediately and walked straight to my bedroom. She stood in the doorway and told me that some things were private and that family did not mean unlimited access, especially family. The next day a padlock appeared on the attic door. That was when curiosity turned into obsession and I started trying everything to get up there while she was at work. Picking the lock failed. Removing the hinges failed. Even trying to reach the attic from the roof failed. She had reinforced everything like she expected someone to try. That was when I started noticing other things that did not make sense. She began buying small children clothes from thrift stores, sizes meant for a 7 or 8-year-old. She washed them carefully and folded them neatly and then they disappeared. She stocked the pantry with juice boxes and string cheese and goldfish crackers. Food meant for kids. And within hours it was gone. Nothing she did added up anymore, and every answer she gave felt rehearsed and thin. One night I stayed awake with my phone recording through the crack in my door. At 11:47 p.m. she went up as usual, but this time I heard something new. Voices, soft talking coming from above. My mother speaking in a tone I had never heard before. Gentle and soothing. She said that everything was okay and that they were safe here and that no one would ever find them. A child responded in a voice too quiet to understand. My blood felt like ice, and I realized she was not alone up there. I called my dad who had moved out 2 years earlier and told him what I had heard. There was a long silence before he told me to leave it alone and said it was complicated. He claimed my mother was protecting someone who could not protect themselves and that was all I needed to know. The way he said it made me feel like the ground shifted under my feet. Because it meant he already knew something and chose not to tell me. While my mother was at her book club, I searched her room and found a folder hidden behind paperwork labeled insurance stocks. Inside were newspaper clippings from 3 years ago about a local boy missing after a house fire. His parents died in the blaze and his body was never found. Investigators suspected arson. The boy's name was Tyler Foster and his picture showed a gap-toothed smile that looked too young for what happened to him. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note saying they would kill him if they found him. That night at 11:47 p.m. my mother walked in and froze when she saw me holding the folder. I said his name out loud and asked if he was in our attic. Her face drained of color and she whispered that they were still looking for him. Before I could say anything else, sirens echoed in the distance and her phone rang. She answered and went pale. She said they found us and ran for the attic door, saying we had to get him out now. When she opened the attic there was no child inside. Instead, there were dozens of monitors showing every room in our house, recording equipment everywhere, and files labeled with names I did not recognize. On a shelf sat a note written in shaky childish handwriting saying my mother did not save me and that she took me like the others. I stood frozen staring at the screens while sirens grew louder outside and my mother screamed behind me. All I could focus on was the note trembling in my hands and the realization that my entire life had been watched. The monitors showed empty rooms because we were all up there now, but I could imagine what they usually displayed. My bedroom while I slept and the kitchen while I ate. I felt sick knowing she had been watching me live without knowing. She grabbed my arm and tried to pull me away, but I broke free and stumbled down the ladder clutching the note. She cried and begged for me to listen, but nothing she could say mattered anymore. I ran to my room and locked the door while she pounded on it, her voice shifting from pleading to anger. The sirens stopped right outside and heavy footsteps approached the front porch. My door shook with every hit and I backed against my bed, holding the note like proof of reality. Through my window, I saw police cars lining the street, officers approaching cautiously with hands near their weapons. My mother rushed downstairs to meet them before they could come inside. I crept to the top of the stairs and watched her open the door with a calm smile that made my skin crawl. She acted confused and helpful like a perfect suburban mother. A tall officer asked if everything was all right and if anyone had called for help. She laughed lightly and said she could not imagine why they were there. When they asked to come inside, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside. Her eyes flicked toward the stairs where I hid, and I knew she was calculating. I stepped down, and every officer looked at me. One asked my name, and when I nodded, my mother's face collapsed, all color gone. The female officer asked if I was okay, and her kindness nearly broke me. I held up the note and told them they needed to see the attic immediately. My mother started talking fast about misunderstandings and stress, but the lead officer stepped between us and asked for permission to search. She refused and said they needed a warrant. The officer asked if I lived there too, and when I said yes, he asked if I gave permission. My mother screamed that I was a minor and that they were violating her rights, but backup was already being called and another officer moved her toward the living room. I said yes again and she lunged toward me screaming that I was ruining everything. 2 officers restrained her as she fought and yelled that those children needed her. They handcuffed her while she sobbed and accused me of destroying what she sacrificed for them. The sound of the cuffs clicking felt like the end of something I never truly had. The officers asked me to show them the attic and my legs shook as I led them upstairs. When their flashlights swept the attic, one of them swore loudly and radioed for backup and forensic teams. The words crime scene echoed down the ladder and made me feel hollow. They told me I had to leave the house and wait outside. I grabbed my phone and backpack and stepped into the night air, feeling unreal. Neighbors watched from porches while more police arrived. I sat on the curb with my head in my hands as red and blue lights reflected off familiar houses. A woman in plain clothes approached and introduced herself as Laura Thurman from the FBI. She asked if I felt safe talking and I handed her the note without speaking. She read it and anger flashed across her face before she tucked it away carefully. She asked me to start from the beginning and I told her everything about the attic visits and the clothes and the voices. She listened quietly and wrote in a small notebook. When I mentioned my dad already knew, her expression hardened and she radioed for someone to bring him in for questioning. People in white suits began carrying equipment into my house and yellow tape went up across the yard. Laura told me I could not go back inside and asked if I had somewhere to stay. I realized my mother had isolated us from everyone for years and there was no one to call. She made arrangements quickly and introduced me to Hannah Nichols, a victim advocate, who stayed beside me while the night unfolded. Eventually, Hannah drove me to a small apartment that served as a safe place. She showed me where everything was and left food I could not eat. I sat on the couch staring at a blank wall while the truth settled in pieces, too large to hold at once. Hours passed and near midnight, Laura returned with grim news in her eyes. She told me they had already found evidence of multiple children connected to the attic. The number was more than I could understand and my hands shook as I tried to breathe. She said they were still searching for Tyler, and that was when I realized nothing about my life would ever be normal again. Laura stayed with me through the night, explaining things slowly like she knew my brain could only handle pieces at a time. She told me I was considered a witness now and that they needed to keep me safe until they understood the full scope of what my mother had done. The word witness felt unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life and not mine. Hannah sat close enough that our shoulders touched and that small contact was the only thing grounding me. They arranged temporary protective housing before sunrise, a place that looked like any other apartment building but carried a weight I could feel in my chest. Hannah drove me there while the city was still quiet, streets empty and ordinary like nothing had happened. The normality made everything feel worse, as if the world had decided to keep spinning without acknowledging what had just shattered. Inside the apartment, everything was neutral and sparse, plain furniture and white walls and no personal history. Hannah showed me the bedroom and the bathroom and told me she would be nearby if I needed anything. I sat on the edge of the bed fully dressed and stared at my hands. They would not stop shaking no matter how hard I pressed them together. When Laura arrived again later that morning, she looked exhausted but focused. She told me they were bringing in forensic teams and specialists, and that the attic was worse than they expected. There were records and footage spanning years, not months. Years. I felt sick hearing that because it meant my childhood ran parallel to something horrific happening right above me. Laura asked if I remembered any times my mother insisted I stay somewhere else overnight or weekends when plans changed suddenly. Memories flooded in that I had never questioned before. Nights I was annoyed about sleeping at a friend's house and weekends sent to my dad unexpectedly. Each memory now felt like a deliberate removal so she could do whatever she wanted without me around. I started crying then. Deep, uncontrollable sobs that left my chest aching. Hannah moved closer and wrapped an arm around me without saying anything. Laura told me gently that what happened was not my fault and that predators were skilled at hiding in plain sight, especially from their own families. Her words made sense, but they did nothing to ease the guilt pressing down on me. Later that afternoon, Laura told me they had located my father and brought him in for questioning. My stomach twisted at the thought of him sitting calmly somewhere explaining how he knew and chose silence. I locked myself in the bathroom and threw up until there was nothing left. Hannah waited outside the door and passed me a damp cloth like she had done this 100 times before. That night's sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the monitors from the attic and imagined my mother watching me through them. The thought that she saw me sleep and eat and laugh without my knowledge made my skin crawl. When morning came, it felt like I had not rested at all, just existed through darkness. Laura returned with updates that only made things heavier. They had identified evidence tied to at least 15 children so far. Names and dates and photographs that spanned almost a decade. My mother had been doing this before we even lived in that house. Before I existed. Realizing that my entire life had been built on top of that truth left me hollow. She told me Tyler Foster had not been found yet, but teams were searching shelters and abandoned areas. The note suggested he escaped recently, and that gave them hope. I clung to that hope because the alternative was too much to hold. Hannah made tea and set it on the table, even though neither of us drank it. Over the next few days, news coverage exploded. Reporters camped outside my house, and neighbors whispered on television segments. My mother's face appeared everywhere, labeled with words I could barely read. Monster, and predator and captor. Seeing her described that way felt surreal because she had been the one who packed my lunches and reminded me to do homework. Laura told me I would need ongoing support and introduced me to a forensic psychologist named Gianna Perez. She spoke calmly and moved slowly like she understood my world was fragile. Gianna explained that children of offenders experience a unique kind of trauma because trust is broken at its core. She said healing would take time, and that I did not need to rush understanding. During one session, Gianna asked me what I felt toward my mother now, and I could not answer. Anger and grief and disbelief tangled together until they became numbness. She told me numbness was also a response, and that my mind was protecting itself. Hearing that helped a little, even if nothing else did. One evening Laura came with news that changed everything. They had found Tyler alive. He had been living on the streets terrified and hiding. When officers approached, he ran until they convinced him he was safe. Hearing that he was alive made me cry harder than anything else had. Relief and sorrow colliding in my chest until I could barely breathe. Laura explained that Tyler confirmed everything, including that my mother had taken him the night his parents died. She had set the fire herself after being confronted. She waited until they slept and then took him as he escaped. Listening to that story felt like falling into cold water. My mother was not just complicit, she was the source of it all. They confirmed more victims through Tyler's testimony and the files. Some had been released when they got older, and some never survived. Each new name felt like another weight added to my chest. Gianna helped me understand that grief for strangers was still valid and that mourning did not require personal connection. A prosecutor named Daniel Ross met with me soon after. He explained the charges they were preparing and that my testimony about discovering the attic would be important. His voice was professional but kind, and he promised to prepare me thoroughly. I nodded even though the idea of speaking in court made my hands shake again. Daniel explained they were seeking life without parole and that the evidence was overwhelming. Part of me wanted to hear that, and another part felt empty. Punishment did not bring back time or lives. It only marked an ending. Hannah squeezed my hand when I signed papers agreeing to cooperate. My father requested to see me from custody, and I refused immediately. Hannah told me I could change my mind later, but there was no pressure. Laura later confirmed he admitted knowing about Tyler, but claimed he believed my mother's story about protection. That excuse made my chest ache because silence had been his choice. Weeks passed in a blur of therapy sessions and updates. I stayed in the apartment, rarely leaving except for appointments. The outside world felt unsafe and intrusive. Hannah checked in daily, and Laura visited whenever she had new information. Their consistency became an anchor in a life that felt unmoored. Eventually, Laura told me my father would likely face charges as well for failure to report and possible accessory involvement. I felt nothing hearing that. Exhaustion had replaced emotion. Gianna said that emotional shutdown was common, and that feeling would return in waves later. One afternoon Laura arrived with a rare look of relief. She told me Tyler had been placed with a foster family experienced in trauma care and that he was beginning therapy. She asked if I wanted to meet him someday. The idea terrified me but also felt necessary. I told her maybe not yet. As the investigation continued, more survivors came forward after seeing the news. Adults now who had been children years ago. Their testimonies painted a pattern that left no doubt about my mother's actions. Daniel said their courage strengthened the case beyond question and ensured there would be no escape for her. One night, lying alone in the apartment, I realized I was grieving not just the children but the mother I thought I had. The person who never truly existed. Gianna later explained that mourning an imagined parent was one of the hardest forms of loss, because there was nothing tangible to bury. By the end of the month, Daniel confirmed my mother accepted a plea deal to avoid trial. Life without parole, plus additional years that meant she would never leave prison. The finality of it settled over me slowly, not as relief but as confirmation that the past could not be undone. Hannah drove me to the courthouse weeks later for preliminary proceedings. Seeing my mother in an orange jumpsuit erased the last illusion I had left. She looked smaller and older, and when our eyes met, I felt nothing at all. That emptiness scared me more than anger ever could. Afterward, Laura sat with me and explained the next steps and resources available: housing assistance, education, support, and long-term counseling. She gave me her personal number and told me to call anytime. That offer felt genuine, and it mattered more than I expected. That night back in the apartment, I sat by the window watching cars pass below, the world moving forward without hesitation. I realized my life would never return to what it was, but it might still become something else. That fragile thought was the first hint that survival was possible even after everything I learned. The weeks after the plea deal felt like living inside thick fog. Days passed, but none of them felt connected to the next. I attended therapy sessions with Gianna twice a week and spent the rest of the time alone in the apartment trying to understand how my entire sense of safety had been dismantled. Some mornings I woke up forgetting for a split second, and then everything crashed back in the moment I remembered who my mother really was. Daniel met with me again to explain the formal charges in detail: kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, child abuse, and murder. Hearing those words spoken calmly in a conference room made my stomach flip. He spread documents across the table with my mother's name typed again and again, legal language turning her into something abstract and distant. He said the state was seeking life without parole, and that with the evidence there was no realistic chance of anything less. I signed papers acknowledging the charges and my role as a witness. My hands shook so badly Hannah had to steady them. Daniel thanked me for cooperating and said I was doing the right thing even though it did not feel like a choice. Afterward, Hannah drove me back to the apartment and we sat in silence for most of the ride because there was nothing left to say. Gianna helped me prepare for what she called complicated grief, explaining that I was mourning multiple things at once: the children, my mother hurt, the life I thought I had, and the illusion of parental safety. She said it was normal to feel conflicting emotions and that healing would not follow a straight line. Some days I believed her, and other days I felt like I was permanently broken. Laura visited every few days with updates from the investigation. Each one revealed more layers of planning and manipulation. My mother kept detailed records, schedules, notes, and contingency plans. She had built an entire hidden life around harming children while maintaining a perfect image to everyone else, including me. Knowing that level of calculation existed under my roof made my skin crawl. One afternoon, Laura told me they had identified at least 4 children who died while in captivity. The confirmation hit harder than anything before. Numbers turned into final outcomes and my hands started shaking uncontrollably. Laura sat beside me without trying to soften the truth. She said acknowledging the full scope mattered even when it hurt. I cried until my chest hurt and Hannah held me until it passed. Not long after that, Laura told me my father accepted a plea deal for his role. 8 years in prison for being an accessory and failing to report what he knew. Hearing the sentence felt strangely empty. Part of me wanted him to suffer more, and another part felt nothing at all. Gianna later explained that emotional numbness often followed prolonged shock and that feeling would return eventually. Hannah asked if I wanted to see my father before his sentencing and I refused without hesitation. The thought of listening to explanations or apologies felt unbearable. She respected that decision and reminded me I was allowed to set boundaries even with family, especially with family. Those words stuck with me. A few weeks later, Laura asked if I felt ready to meet Tyler in a supervised setting. She said he knew who I was and that the meeting might help both of us. Fear and guilt twisted together in my chest, but I agreed because avoiding him felt like another kind of betrayal. Gianna prepared me carefully, explaining that Tyler might not respond the way I hoped and that silence did not mean rejection. The meeting took place in a quiet office with neutral colors and soft lighting. Gianna sat between us and Tyler's foster mother stayed nearby. He looked smaller than I imagined and older at the same time. His eyes carried something heavy that made it hard to breathe. When I tried to apologize, the words came out awkward and insufficient. He nodded once without speaking and stared at the floor. We sat in silence for several minutes that felt like hours. Eventually, Gianna suggested a break and Tyler left the room without looking back. I felt like I failed somehow, but Gianna later explained that the meeting mattered, even if it felt awful. Tyler needed to see me and hear that I did not know and that I was sorry. Healing did not always feel good. After that meeting, I slept poorly for days. Dreams filled with images of the attic and fire and monitors flickering in dark rooms. Gianna taught me grounding techniques to help when panic set in. Slow breathing, naming objects in the room, reminding myself I was safe now. Sometimes they worked and sometimes they did not. Daniel contacted me again to discuss the sentencing hearing. He asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement. The idea terrified me, but I said yes because the victims deserved acknowledgement. Daniel sent guidelines and I spent days staring at a blank document trying to find words that could hold that much truth without breaking me. Writing the statement forced me to confront everything at once. The betrayal, the guilt, the unanswered questions. I wrote about discovering the attic and realizing my life had been a cover for something monstrous. I wrote about sleeping peacefully while children suffered above me, and the weight of that knowledge. When I finished, I felt drained but strangely lighter. The day of the sentencing, Hannah drove me to the courthouse early in the morning. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and everything felt harsh and exposed. My mother sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I remembered. When our eyes met, I felt nothing at all. Not anger, not sadness, just absence. When Daniel called my name, I walked to the podium on shaking legs and read my statement out loud. My voice stayed steady even when my mother started crying halfway through. I did not look at her again, and when I finished, I returned to my seat without hesitation. The judge sentenced her to life without parole, plus additional years, and it was over quickly. Afterward, Daniel brought me to a private room where surviving victims and families gathered. Sitting in a circle with people who understood this specific pain made me feel less alone. A woman whose child did not survive thanked me for coming forward. Her gratitude felt undeserved, but I accepted it because refusing would hurt her. Tyler's foster parents approached me afterward and told me he was improving slowly. Therapy 3 times a week, learning to trust again. They thanked me for exposing the truth, even though it cost me everything. Their words tightened my throat, and I realized that being brave did not always feel heroic. Sometimes it just felt necessary. In the months that followed, I worked closely with Hannah and Laura to rebuild some sense of normalcy. They helped me apply for education support and housing assistance and eventually transition into my own small apartment across town. It was modest and quiet and mine. The privacy felt like a gift. I enrolled in online school to finish my education. Walking into a physical classroom felt impossible with the media tension still lingering. Studying alone was difficult but manageable and gave me something to focus on besides the past. Gianna encouraged structure, saying routine helped rebuild a sense of control. Therapy continued twice a week and slowly something shifted. The guilt still surfaced, but it did not crush me as completely as before. There were moments when I could think about the future without feeling hopeless. Those moments were small, but they mattered. Laura stayed in touch regularly, checking in by phone or text. She became something like a mentor, proof that trustworthy adults existed even if my parents failed me. She sent me information about advocacy programs and support organizations, suggesting paths I might explore when I felt ready. I started volunteering with a local organization that supported families affected by crime. Listening to others talk about loving someone who did terrible things helped me feel less isolated. My story was different, but the shame and confusion were familiar. Helping them find words for their feelings gave my own pain a kind of purpose. Tyler and I continued meeting once a month in supervised sessions. Our relationship was careful and quiet, but built on understanding. We did not talk much about the past, mostly just played cards or watched movies. Seeing him laugh sometimes made something loosen in my chest. One afternoon, Tyler suggested planting a tree together at his foster family's house, a living thing to mark survival. We dug the hole together and planted a young maple. As we packed dirt around the roots, he spoke the names of the children who did not survive. Saying them out loud felt important. honoring them in a way no courtroom could. As the tree settled into the ground, Tyler squeezed my hand briefly, a small gesture that said more than words could. I realized healing did not mean forgetting, it meant carrying the truth differently, allowing life to grow alongside loss. By the end of the year, I felt changed in ways I could not fully explain. Still scarred, still grieving, but no longer drowning. Gianna said this was the beginning of integration, learning to live with the knowledge without letting it consume me. I did not know what the future held, but for the first time I believed there might be one worth building. Life after the sentencing did not suddenly become easier, but it became quieter in a way that allowed me to breathe again. The constant rush of investigators and court dates slowed, and I was left alone with the reality of what came next. My small apartment felt empty at first, but also safe. There were no hidden cameras, no locked doors, no secrets humming above my head, just silence and the faint sounds of the city outside. Hannah helped me settle into this new place. She brought groceries and helped me fill out forms for assistance programs. She never rushed me or treated me like a problem to solve. She treated me like a person learning how to exist again. That mattered more than I could explain. Some nights she stayed on the phone with me until I fell asleep because the quiet felt too loud. Laura continued checking in regularly, sometimes with updates and sometimes just to ask how I was doing. She never pushed me to talk about the case unless I wanted to. Instead, she talked about normal things like books she was reading or places she wanted to visit someday. Those conversations reminded me that the world was bigger than what happened to me. Gianna shifted our therapy focus from crisis management to rebuilding identity. She asked questions about who I was before everything fell apart and who I wanted to be now. At first I could not answer because my sense of self felt shattered. Slowly pieces came back through memories of things I enjoyed and values I held that had nothing to do with my parents. One day Gianna asked how I felt about my last name and the connection it carried. The question lingered with me for weeks before I finally admitted that hearing it made my stomach tighten. It was a reminder of my mother, and the headlines and the attic. Gianna explained that changing a name could be a way of reclaiming agency rather than erasing the past. With Hannah's help, I filed the paperwork at the courthouse to change my name. My hands shook as I signed the forms, but when the clerk stamped the final document, something inside me shifted. It was not relief exactly, but possibility. Like I had been holding my breath for years without realizing it and could finally inhale. Around the same time, Daniel contacted me about the house. He explained it would be seized and eventually sold through the court system. The proceeds would go into a fund for the victims to support therapy and medical care. He told me I was legally entitled to inheritance as my mother's child, but that I could refuse it if I wished. I signed the refusal papers without hesitation because I wanted nothing tied to her. Daniel told me the fund would make a real difference for the survivors and families. Hearing that helped ease some of the guilt I still carried. Knowing something good could come from that place of horror did not make it right, but it made it less meaningless. A journalist reached out through Hannah asking if I would consider sharing my story for a larger piece about hidden abuse. My first instinct was to say no because attention still felt dangerous. Gianna encouraged me to think about it as an opportunity to reclaim my narrative and help others recognize warning signs. After several sessions preparing boundaries, I agreed. The interview took place in a quiet coffee shop far from my neighborhood. The journalist listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. Talking for hours was exhausting but also freeing. Saying everything out loud without fear of consequence felt like releasing pressure I did not know I carried. When it ended, I felt lighter even though I cried on the drive home. Not long after that letter arrived from a small college several states away. I had applied almost absent-mindedly through a program for survivors of violent crime. The envelope was thick and official, and when I opened it, my hands trembled. I had been accepted with a full scholarship covering tuition, housing, and books. For the first time since everything fell apart, I cried tears that felt like hope. Hannah helped me prepare for the move, shopping for basics and talking through logistics. Leaving the city felt terrifying and necessary at the same time. Part of me wanted distance from everything familiar, and part of me feared starting over where no one knew the truth. Before leaving, I visited Tyler one last time at his foster family's home. He looked healthier than before, with more color in his face. We talked about school and movies, and planted another small tree together in their yard. Something about putting roots into the ground felt symbolic, even if we did not say it out loud. The night before I left, I barely slept, lying awake thinking about who I would be in this new place. Whether I would tell anyone about my past or keep it locked away. Gianna reminded me that I was allowed to choose what parts of my story to share and when. That my trauma did not entitle anyone else to my pain. Moving into the dorm felt surreal. Boxes stacked and strangers everywhere laughing and arguing about trivial things. My roommate was kind and curious and knew nothing about my history. That anonymity felt like a gift. For the first time in years, I was just another student figuring things out. Classes were challenging but grounding. Having assignments and deadlines gave structure to my days. I chose courses in psychology and social work almost instinctively. Learning about trauma and family systems gave me language for experiences I never understood. It also fueled a quiet determination to protect children who could not protect themselves. Therapy continued through video sessions with G. We talked about balancing ambition with self-care and recognizing triggers. Some nights the nightmares returned and I woke up shaking. Other nights I slept deeply and woke surprised by the absence of fear. Healing moved in waves just as she predicted. I joined a study group and slowly made friends. People who complained about exams and roommates and nothing heavier than that. Laughing with them felt strange at first, like I was betraying the seriousness of what I survived. Gianna reminded me that joy did not diminish grief and that both could exist at the same time. Halfway through the year, I declared my major in social work with a focus on child welfare. When I told Laura during one of our calls, she sounded proud and said she had always seen advocacy in me. Hearing that from someone I trusted made the choice feel solid. I started volunteering with a local foster support organization, helping kids with homework and activities. Every child I worked with felt like a quiet promise to the ones my mother hurt. I could not undo the past, but I could show up now. That purpose steadied me on days when guilt threatened to pull me under. Tyler and I stayed in touch through letters and occasional supervised calls. He told me about making the soccer team and having friends. His progress reminded me that healing was possible even after unimaginable harm. His resilience inspired me on days I felt fragile. 2 years passed more gently than I expected. The memories did not disappear, but they no longer defined every moment. I learned coping strategies for panic and found comfort in routines and relationships built on honesty. Laura remained a steady presence, checking in and offering guidance when I needed it. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Tyler written in careful handwriting. He told me his foster family officially adopted him and that he finally felt safe. Reading his words, I cried quietly in my dorm room. These tears were different, filled with relief and gratitude. Knowing he had a future helped me believe in my own. I wrote back that night, telling him how proud I was and how much his strength meant to me. Mailing that letter felt like closing a loop that began the night I found the attic. It did not erase what happened, but it marked how far we had both come. Looking back, I realized survival was not a single moment but a series of choices made every day. Choosing to get out of bed, choosing to trust, choosing to imagine a future. My life would always carry the weight of what my mother did, but it no longer crushed me. I understood now that healing did not mean forgetting or forgiving. It meant learning to live fully despite the truth. It meant building something new from the wreckage and allowing myself to step into a world that was still capable of kindness. As I stood on campus one evening watching the sun set behind old brick buildings, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. I could carry my story without being consumed by it. I could move forward while honoring those who could not. And that knowledge gave me the strength to keep going even when the path ahead was uncertain. By the time my second year of college began, I could finally feel the distance between who I was becoming and the girl who once lived under that attic. The memories still surfaced, but they no longer hijacked every thought. Some mornings I woke up and the first thing I noticed was sunlight instead of fear. Those mornings felt like small victories I learned to protect. I kept therapy as a constant anchor. Weekly sessions that helped me untangle guilt from responsibility and grief from identity. Gianna reminded me often that surviving did not mean I owed the world constant suffering. She said I was allowed to build a life that felt meaningful and even joyful, even with the truth of my past always present. My coursework deepened my understanding of trauma and family systems. Learning the science behind manipulation and control helped me contextualize what my mother did without excusing it. Knowledge gave me distance and clarity. It also sharpened my resolve to work in child advocacy and prevention rather than remain trapped in the role of witness. I continued volunteering with foster support programs and eventually began training as a peer advocate. Sitting with children who had been removed from unsafe homes taught me the power of simple presence. Sometimes, what they needed most was someone who listened without judgment. I recognized parts of myself in their guarded expressions and silent strength. Laura and I stayed in regular contact, sometimes talking about career paths and sometimes about ordinary life. She encouraged me to consider internships with advocacy organizations and federal programs. Knowing someone like her believed in my future helped counter the lingering belief that my past defined my limits. Hannah checked in less frequently as I grew more independent, but her support never disappeared. She reminded me that needing help again did not mean failure. Those words stayed with me on nights when anxiety crept back unexpectedly and sleep felt distant. Tyler and I maintained our careful connection. Letters and occasional supervised calls filled with updates about school and hobbies. He talked about soccer practice and new friends and the dog his foster family adopted. Hearing his laughter through the phone was proof that healing could exist alongside scars. During one call, Tyler told me he wanted to become a teacher someday. Someone kids could trust. His words settled deep in my chest because they mirrored my own hopes in a different form. We were both trying to turn survival into something that mattered. The journalist eventually published her book, and my chapter was handled with care and restraint. Reading my own words in print was surreal but empowering. I saw my story framed not as spectacle, but as warning and resilience. Strangers reached out with messages saying they recognized signs they once ignored. That impact made the vulnerability worth it. As media attention faded, I found comfort in anonymity again. On campus, I was known for my dedication and empathy, not for my family history. Friends knew me as reliable and thoughtful, and occasionally stubborn. Those identities felt earned rather than imposed. I dated cautiously, learning how to trust in small steps. Intimacy came with triggers, but also with moments of connection that reminded me I was capable of healthy relationships. Gianna helped me navigate boundaries and communication without shame. One afternoon, during a campus event focused on child welfare policy, I was asked to speak briefly about survivor perspectives. Standing at the podium, I felt nervous but grounded. I spoke about the importance of listening to subtle signs and believing children even when the truth is uncomfortable. Afterward, several students approached me wanting to get involved. That moment reinforced my sense of purpose. As graduation approached, conversations about the future became unavoidable. I applied to graduate programs in social work with a focus on trauma-informed care. Writing my personal statement forced me to reflect on how far I had come and how intentionally I had shaped my path. Acceptance letters arrived slowly but steadily. The day I received confirmation from my top choice program, I sat quietly in my dorm room letting the reality sink in. I was moving forward not despite my past, but with wisdom shaped by it. That distinction mattered more than any external achievement. Before leaving campus for the summer, I visited Tyler and his family again. The maple tree we planted earlier had grown taller and stronger. its leaves full and green. We stood beside it in silence, acknowledging what it represented without needing to explain. Tyler squeezed my hand briefly like he always did, a small ritual that grounded both of us. I thanked his foster parents for everything they had given him, and they thanked me for staying present in his life. Mutual gratitude flowed easily without guilt. That summer, I returned briefly to the city where everything began to attend a conference on victim advocacy. Walking past familiar streets felt strange but no longer paralyzing. The house I once lived in had been sold and renovated, its new owners unaware of its history. I felt no urge to see it again. At the conference, I met other advocates and survivors who shared similar stories of betrayal and rebuilding. Connecting with them expanded my understanding of resilience and community. We were all proof that identity could be reclaimed after profound loss. Laura attended one of the panels, and afterward we shared coffee like old friends. She told me she was proud of the work I was doing and that seeing me thrive reminded her why she chose her career. Her words filled a space in me that once longed for parental approval. As time passed, my nightmares became less frequent, and when they did occur, I had tools to ground myself afterward. Panic no longer dictated my days. I trusted my ability to cope even when memories resurfaced. Graduation day arrived, wrapped in warmth and possibility. Sitting among classmates in my cap and gown, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not just for academic success but for enduring something that once felt Hannah and Laura both attended the ceremony, standing proudly in the crowd. Seeing them there reminded me that family could be chosen and built through care and consistency rather than blood. Afterward we celebrated with simple food and laughter, moments that felt ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Joy no longer felt like betrayal but like affirmation. Later that night alone in my apartment, I reflected on the journey from that first night of discovery to this moment of calm. I acknowledged the pain without letting it overshadow the present. Acceptance had replaced denial, and purpose had softened grief. I wrote one last letter to Tyler before leaving for graduate school, telling him how much his courage meant to me and how excited I was for our futures. Sealing the envelope felt like honoring a chapter without closing the book entirely. As I packed my belongings preparing for the next step, I noticed how little I carried compared to before. Material things mattered less now. What I valued most were relationships and direction. On my final evening before moving, I stood by the window watching city lights blur into stars. I felt gratitude for surviving and determination to protect others. My story would always be part of me, but it no longer owned me. I understood that healing was ongoing and non-linear. Setbacks would come and grief would resurface, but I also knew I had built a foundation strong enough to hold it all. The attic that once defined my fear no longer held power over my future. I had transformed discovery into advocacy and trauma into purpose. That transformation was not heroic, but it was real. As I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I felt something steady and enduring settle in my chest. Not closure but confidence. Confidence that I could face whatever came next with honesty and compassion. My life was not defined by what my mother did, but by what I chose to do afterward. And that choice would continue guiding me forward one step at a time.